The central question that this video project is going to attempt to answer is, how is the internet changing our perception of the world? When you boil it down, it really is fundamentally asking about what philosophers call epistemology. Epistemology is the study of the ways that we come to have accurate knowledge about the world and how we know that this knowledge is accurate. The world exists, however it does exist, independently of whether what we hold within our perspective in our brains about it is actually true or not. So making sure that our understandings about the world are accurate and consistent with how the world actually is one of the most important tasks of our lives. The internet has brought lasting changes to the mediums through which we can gather information about the world. It has also changed the way that the past structures of information dissemination of TV channels and newspapers operate and the power that they have to influence what we think. In recent years, questions of whether we can trust the information we are disseminated have rapidly increased. But could we have trusted in the past either before the internet? When you put the central question in this context, what you're really asking about becomes more clear. The question actually is, in America, how has the development of the internet benefited or drawn back the average person's epistemic grasp on the world compared to before the advent of the internet? Something that might be able to help approach this question is understanding something in philosophy's study of knowledge, a distinction to make between two types of claims you can make about the world: normative claims and descriptive claims. Descriptive claims are arguments about the current state of the world around us. What is the actual percentage of Americans who believe the election was stolen? Are immigrants crossing the border and committing more crimes than the average American citizen? What is the exact arrangement of atoms and neurons in my brain that led me to saying this sentence? All of these things are part of reality that can be measured if we do enough work and gain enough knowledge about the exact current state of the world. The problem is that for a lot of things, we don't have this knowledge yet for some reason or another, and because of this, it feels out of reach. However, it is an objective reality, and the answers to it do exist right now, even if we can't get to them because of whatever limits we're dealing with. Normative claims, on the other hand, are arguments about what we should try to make the world like in the future. Should we overturn the election? Should we let more immigrants into the country? Should I have phrased the sentence in the way that I did? Every single normative claim has to be founded upon descriptive claims to support it. Given the evidence or lack of evidence of election fraud, should we overturn this election? However, at the end of the day, you really never know whether your answer is right and what the consequences will be, since the future hasn't happened yet and we don't know what it'll be like. You are taking a leap of faith and saying that since we have these supporting facts and understandings from the past, it seems likely that this decision about what we should do in the future will lead to a good outcome. You can make very educated guesses, but you cannot know. The answer only exists in the future, which does not exist right now. In our world, the focus is mostly on how the world should be, rather than trying to declare the factual statements about how the world currently is. This is a problem because every single should claim requires a lot of is claims to back up the facts, but the ises are so cluttered in modern society because of all the misinformation that exists. We have to be able to agree on the shared contents of our reality first before we can decide on how to apply these to make the world how we want. We are having a very hard time right now agreeing on these contents. 3 months after Biden became president, it was estimated that 50 million Republicans still thought that the election was fraudulent. This is not an opinion claim about how we should make the world in the future. This is a factual claim about what exactly went down in the past that cannot be debated, yet so many people in our country cannot even agree upon it. In class on this topic, we talked about whether we can identify photoshopped images on the internet. A study reported that we can identify a photoshopped image only 60% of the time, which is only 10% above a random guess. When we then asked the people to identify what in particular was photoshopped, they only got it right 45% of the time. Some of the photos were photoshopped for the difference to not be that hidden, and some were made for it to be hidden pretty well, but regardless, these are really uninspiring numbers considering that they were all man-made. Imagine how hard photoshops are going to be to detect when AI learns how to make them indistinguishable from reality. Now, beyond images, think about the fact that photos actually somewhat have direct evidence you can look at of what's going on that you can directly see. Imagine how much harder it must be to decipher what information you read online about the world is real when you have no tangible evidence into what's happening besides the words that people write for you to read or speak for you to hear. So for the rest of this project, we're going to talk about and compare and contrast the structures of information dissemination of the past and present, as well as look at what might come in the future. In the past, the two main structures of information dissemination were newspapers and TV news channels. As much as it may seem compared to the mess that we have now, that these structures were totally pure and only wanted to spread the best news to the world to benefit every single person in the world, this was absolutely not the case. They were not separate and not purified from the societal systems that allow corruption to seep through. There were businesses that were incredibly intertwined with the world around them and depended on that world for support in a way that filtered what news they were able to spread. One of the best books on this topic is called Manufacturing Consent by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky. It describes 5 filters that a story had to pass through before being allowed to become news and be shared to the masses. Whatever couldn't pass through these filters, even if it was a story necessary to expose corruption or create positive social change, were rarely released. So here are those 5 filters the book describes. Filter 1, size, ownership, and profit orientation. Since before the 1900s, there's been a general trend towards greater media integration, where the power of the small local medias have been steadily decreasing, and the power of the large, mega-conglomerate media corporations have been steadily increasing. Smaller companies don't have anywhere near the outreach and resources the larger companies do, and they really cannot compete. It is this top tier that defines the news agenda and supplies much of the national and international news to the lower tiers of the media, and therefore to the general public. These companies are large, profit-seeking corporations owned and controlled by quite wealthy people. They are fully integrated into the market, and the pressures of the stockholders, directors, and bankers to focus on the bottom line, profits, are powerful. The greater profitability of the media in a deregulated environment has also led to an increase in takeovers and takeover threats. This has forced the management of the media giants to focus ever more aggressively and unequivocally on profitability. If managers fail to pursue actions that favor stockholder returns, institutional investors will be inclined to sell the stock or listen sympathetically to outsiders contemplating takeovers. The system is basically designed to attract the more ruthless of people to positions of power who will do what is needed to make money and cut ethical corners in doing so. And that is not a system that just exists in huge news companies. It exists in many other places as well. Filter 2, the advertising license to do business. Advertisers acquire a de facto licensing authority since without their support, media ceases to be economically viable. If as a news source you don't have advertisements, you're put at a serious disadvantage. Your prices are going to be higher, curtailing sales, and you're going to have less surplus to invest in improving your features. For this reason, an advertising-based system will tend to drive out of existence or into marginality the media companies that depend on revenue from sales alone. Because of this, media compete for the patronage of advertisers, developing specialized staff to solicit advertisers and necessarily having to explain how their programs serve advertisers' needs. Many advertising firms will refuse to patronize ideological enemies and those who they perceive as damaging to their interests. Advertisers will additionally want to avoid programs with serious complexities and disturbing controversies that interfere with the buying mood in the public that makes the money. Filter 3, sourcing mass media news. The media need a steady, reliable flow of the raw materials of news. They cannot afford to have reporters and cameras at all places where important stories may break. So, on a federal level, the White House, the Pentagon, State Department, etc., as well as on the local level, the City Hall and Police Department are central nodes of news activity because news is always flowing from there. Business corporations and trade groups are also big regulars and seen as credible as well. This all is partly a matter of cost. Taking information from sources that may be presumed credible reduces investigative expense, whereas material from sources that are not as well known may cause skepticism to arise or elicit criticism and threats, requiring careful checking of them and costly research. The large bureaucracies of the powerful subsidize the mass media and gain special access by their contribution to reducing the media's costs of acquiring the raw materials of and producing news. In the case of our government, the subsidy is at the taxpayer's expense, at our expense. The large entities that provide this become routine news sources and have privileged access to the gates. Non-routine news sources must struggle for access and may be ignored by the gatekeepers. The powerful can use personal relationships, threats, and rewards to further influence and coerce the media. The media may feel obligated to carry out dubious stories and mute criticism in order to not offend their sources and disturb a close relationship. It is very difficult to call others liars when we depend on them for daily news. The powerful also shape the supply of experts. If the experts agree with the narrative they're trying to portray, they'll put them on a payroll as consultants, they will fund their research, and they will organize think tanks that will hire them directly and help us disseminate their messages. Other experts who disagree with their narrative will be deterred from letting their word get out. Filter 4, flack and the enforcers. Flack refers to negative responses to a media statement or program. If flack is produced on a large scale, or by individual or groups with substantial resources, it can both be uncomfortable and costly to the media. Filter 5, anti-communism. Communism in America has always been a buzzword that people get horrified at the sight of. This stems back to the Cold War and fears of the Soviet Union. However, the concept of communism is fuzzy and used like a trap card against a lot of left-leaning plans to cut them off without real consideration of the benefits and drawbacks of the specific policy. If politicians allow communism, or something that can be labeled communism, to get through while they are in office, the political costs are heavy. So, to summarize everything from manufacturing consent, the 5 filters of size and profit orientation, maintaining of advertiser support, maintaining of relationships with big sources of news, avoiding a flack organized by the powerful, and anti-communism, narrow the range of news that passes through the gates, and even more sharply limit what can become big news, subject to sustained news campaigns over time. Messages from and about dissidents and weak, unorganized individuals and groups, domestic and foreign, are at initial disadvantage in sourcing costs and credibility, as they often do not agree with the ideology or interests of the gatekeepers and other powerful parties that influence the filtering process. The powerful influencing media has always been around and has been a huge determining factor in what information has been disseminated in society in order to maintain the status quo that has kept them in power. A big example of this is during the 1917 influenza pandemic. Because of the war effort they're trying to keep up, the U.S. passed the Sedition Act, which made it a crime to say anything that the government perceived as harming to the country or to the war effort. As a result, the media sugarcoated the news and censored themselves. The lack of truth coming out about the pandemic led to a lot of unnecessary deaths in the army and at home that could have been avoided. In September 1918, Philadelphia hosted the Liberty Loan March as a war bonds raiser as the flu was running rampant. In anticipation of this, doctors tried to go to the press to get them to warn the citizens that it was not safe, but everyone refused to write articles or print doctors' letters of concern on the topic. These doctors then tried to go to Philadelphia's public health director to cancel the march since the press wouldn't help, and guess what? They got denied there too. So during the next month, the flu would go on to kill 12,191 people in Philadelphia, a number that certainly would have been much smaller were it not for this march. This is obviously a special case because it was during wartime, but regardless, think about the responsibility that the media have to get the truth, and how often they cannot do so. What does this story remind you of? Trump rallies caused distinct increases in the amount of COVID cases in the surrounding areas as well, except that his reasoning for keeping the rally going wasn't for winning a war, it was for getting reelected. And after this happened, many media sources across the country denied any increases in COVID resulting back from these rallies. Now let's go back even further to the beginning of our country, where even there, the media was a problem. From Thomas Jefferson's presidency, he was left with the feeling that the media corroded the truth. He said that, quote, "Nothing now can be believed which is seen in a newspaper. Truth itself becomes suspicious by being put into that polluted vehicle." John Adams, during his presidential campaign against Jefferson, used the press to attack Jefferson's racial heritage, calling him the son of a half-breed Indian squaw, sired by a Virginia mulatto father. Despite there being rumors circulating around about this, there was very little evidence that both Jefferson's father and mother had any descent in their family that was not white, and this is what academics currently believe. Despite these two examples, overall the information that got out and was released to the press in the past was generally pretty accurate. The problem was that there was a lot of information that was left out. We will now see how this contrasts to the present, where all the information in the world is let out in a massive frenzy, and because of this, it's hard to tell what is real and what is not real. Now on to present structures of information dissemination. Most of what I'll say here comes from the Center for Information Technology and Public Life's summary of all the current research on this topic. The trend of large media companies surviving while the smaller local companies die off is continuing from the past and actually getting worse now, and COVID-19 was especially a huge hit. In America, 200 counties do not have a local newspaper, nearly 50% of the counties only have one newspaper, usually a weekly one, and more than 6% of counties have no dedicated news coverage at all. Online media sources cannot fill this void because they're focused on areas where there are the most people that click on their websites, see advertisements, and make the money. In order to survive, they cannot direct resources towards the small communities. Online platforms can also offer their services to users for free, and as a result, people have become increasingly unwilling to pay for news when they can get it for no cost online or on social media. Today in America, 6 mega conglomerates control 90% of the media outlets that exist today: AT&T, CBS, Comcast, Disney, News Corp, and Viacom. In 1983, there used to be 50 companies that controlled 90% of the media, and before that, there were even more. This trend is not something good. Local news isn't something we should just abandon. They inform the community about local government, elections, and other events. They shape community values and beliefs, and they create shared heritage that can unite people. Yet the systems that we're working within are making this happen. The internet's growth allows more people to create and instantly spread narratives. You might think that this is initially a great thing, that let great ideas get increased recognition and bubble up to the surface to unite people and unite the world. However, this assumes that people can recognize these good ideas how they are, and sadly the reality is that people aren't just objective like that. People have a wide spectrum of views, and they will tend to form online bubbles with other people who share those views. The extremes will remain extreme, and really, if anything, will only be bolstered by feeling validated by all the people online who agree with them to a point where they start expanding and sharing their views with others and spreading misinformation. With online platforms taking over, people get most of their news from social media, leaving them very vulnerable to misinformation and attempts to politically polarize them. People are increasingly reliant on information sources that are either incomplete, misleading, or deceptive. Platforms have been given lots of freedom to decide what content to allow on their services. However, they aren't equipped to deal with the problem of misinformation on their own, and they know this. They are working on ways to respond to harmful content, but they view themselves as lacking the legitimacy and capacity to serve as arbiters of truth. Many have called for additional federal regulation, combating election interference, and addressing data privacy. The default state of platforms is to use detailed caches of user data to target posts of their users with machine learning algorithms that they know will entice them and keep them on the platform for longer amounts of time, where they can then be given advertisements that make the company money. Moving away from that baseline, they're now trying to adjust to better get out the truth and good opinions, but this is a very difficult task, and these algorithms are hard to make work in this way. Research from the University of Colorado Boulder found that Facebook is the central conduit for the transfer of fake news. It was found that those who were the most extreme conservative shared 26% of the fake news on Facebook and 32% of the fake news on Twitter. And those who were the most extreme liberal shared 17.5% of the fake news on Facebook and 16.4% of the fake news on Twitter. So it is not just one extreme that is spreading the misinformation. It is both extremes, although one extreme is doing it slightly more than the other. People who are more ideologically extreme will share more fake news to support their side, whether they're consciously doing this or they're under the same spell as those who they're sharing it with too, and genuinely believe that what they're sharing is true when it is not. Just like I talked about earlier with descriptive and normative claims, we can disagree about what's best to do for the future, but when we fundamentally disagree in the facts supporting these claims, it's hard for a democracy to survive. In the world we're in, the powerful corporate and government leaders most able to improve the information environment profit most when it is in turmoil like it currently is. It is in their self-interest to not improve the systems, because as long as the system is not improved, they can remain in power and keep lining their pockets with money. To be fair, some of them may be able to think beyond their self-interest and work for the betterment of the world, but you can look for yourself at the current state of the world and think about whether this is actually happening or not. Imagine this example. The most popular news broadcaster in, let's say, the Soviet Union defended their spreading of misinformation that is polarizing the nation by saying that the broadcaster is engaging in exaggeration and non-literal commentary from which any reasonable viewer will arrive with an appropriate amount of skepticism about the statements he makes, and they win the court case. Would you from America, the greatest country in the world, look at this and call out how disgusting and corrupt it is? I would. Well, this was literally the legal defense in court of Tucker Carlson, America's most popular news broadcaster, that won the court case. The literally most viewed news anchor in America right now, with over 3 million nightly viewers, has been granted by law free reign to say whatever he wants, no matter how it affects people or the nation, as long as he can later on say that if the viewers were reasonable, they wouldn't take what he said so seriously. How dangerous is that? Another more obvious example is Trump, and all the lies that he has said on social media. Someone documented all the falsities over his presidency and found that on average, he would publicly lie 12 times a day. No company or government official stopped him from spewing out whatever he wanted, besides minor and rare fact checks online, even as people warned that the sort of falsehoods he was spreading would lead to violence, as they ended up doing on January 6th when the Capitol was stormed. Additionally, imagine how many unnecessary people died from COVID-19 because Trump acted like it wasn't as big of a problem as it was. As early as February, Olivia Troy, someone who worked on the White House coronavirus task force, said that the Trump administration knew it wasn't a matter of if COVID would become a big pandemic in the United States, it was a matter of when. And throughout the first many months of the pandemic, President Trump had consistently told Americans the complete opposite of what his health experts had been telling him in private meetings about COVID-19. It is simply a fact now that politicians who are greedy and self-interested know that they can lie, and that people online will believe them if they do it right. So think about it. There probably has always been the same amount of people who would do this if they had the opportunity to, but only now is it actually possible. It is really easy to provide information to your supporters who are in an echo chamber of people who only share the exact same views as people in there that confirm their beliefs. And people are actively engaging this behavior whether we like it or not. And what I've talked about here so far is all internal within the United States, when the reality is that other rival countries are intentionally trying to slew in misinformation to try to cause problems for our democracy. In the 1980s, before the internet was a huge factor, Russia planted a lie that AIDS was essentially a bioweapon cooked up in a US lab with the purpose of performing a genocide on the black community, and targeted the black community with this lie. To this day, there's still a decent portion of black people who still believe this story. There's also a lot of evidence that Russia messed with our presidential election in 2016. How many more subtle ways are other countries using these platforms and the information they disseminate to disturb our democracy? One final point to consider is how social media more slowly influences how the opinions of neutral people form. So as humans, what we do is we have our ideas, we compare it to others, and we find out what's the best and stick with that best perspective. In addition to regular social circles, we now have social media posts and comment sections where we see other people's opinions and see what's most liked. Here we crowdsource our reasoning and see what's best. Often, but not always, you don't get a much in-depth rationale behind the idea that you see, and you see the idea at a surface level. We have to be wary of whether what we're seeing is objectively good, or whether it's just a socially common perspective among those who are following this account and therefore is getting likes right now. Think about all the homophobic comments you might see under an NFL gay pride post a couple years ago. If social media were around in the 1950s, imagine all the anti-equality comments you might see under a post from Martin Luther King Jr. These things can confirm our biases and reinforce them. Be careful about taking the opinions of the masses at face value. So in summary, our current media system produces too little high-quality information. We have a tendency to be attracted to information that confirms our existing biases about the world, and to share this information with little regard for how much it might spread to others. And there's an increasing number of actors who seek to leverage these observations to distort public discourse and to undermine democratic decision-making. This will likely be a problem I have to deal with for a while. Now let's look to the future. Synthetic AI media is going to completely transform how we perceive the world, because in the future, anybody will be able to create content of a quality that is only possible for Hollywood studios right now, for little to no cost, using apps or software that'll make it accessible to anyone. People want the cheapest, most emotionally salient media, and they want it endlessly, and synthetic media will be able to provide it. This would be okay if it weren't for the fact that we know that there are people intent on spreading misinformation with an evil political purpose. So unfortunately, it is simply a fact that people are going to leverage this to further divide society from itself and increase political polarization. This is horrible for any democratic country, because in a world where anything can be faked, everybody becomes a target. Any evidence in the form of videos, photos, or audios can be faked and denied. Machine learning algorithms can learn to fake the way that people's specific voices sound and faces move to create videos that truly seem like they're this person speaking. It goes this deep. Evidence say that we see as an extension of our own reality can be faked, and the real evidence can be denied. The very basis of what reality is can start to become corroded. Of course, reality itself will remain, but our perception of it, because of where we get our information from, will become increasingly clouded. It is not just to misinform people, it is to break people's commitment to being informed at all, because they realize how hopeless it is. And once this happens, and we all just tune out, we let the powerful do whatever they want with total free reign. In America, how much has this already happened? How much of an apathy of politics has the average person come into, especially a young person? So in order to fight this, we have to rely on building the AI software to detect fakes. There's a lot of investment in this right now. The original deepfakes were only meant to fool human eyes, but recently there have been measures to make them also indistinguishable to detection algorithms as well. So it's literally an arms race between deepfake AI and AI software to detect the fakes, and who knows where it's going to end up in the future. So, in conclusion, we're looking at the ways through which we come to understand reality and how imperfect they are. We all live in somewhat different worlds. In the past, it was easier to live in a shared reality because there wasn't such a frenzy of information being thrown onto you like there is right now with the internet. However, in the past, that reality included a lot of cover-ups and bias that favored those in power. This system somewhat still remains in the present, but the internet has definitely become the dominant force. In the chaos of the internet, bubbles of people with shared beliefs are popping up, and it's becoming more clear that with the dangerous misinformation some of these groups intend to spread across the internet, they cannot be given free rein. We have to create systems to make sure that the descriptive claims people are making are true. People, no matter where they lie politically, can make whatever normative claims they want to make, but they cannot be allowed to lie about the facts that underlie them all. Deepfake AI presents a huge threat to us, being able to continue and believing in a large portion of the reality we're trying to agree on. Everything will no longer be able to act on anecdotes of one story, but rather on proven stuff that comes from 100% confirmed, trusted sources. Our need for a tight grasp on reality will become more and more necessary in order to continue moving forward. Our understanding of a common reality and further finding ways to live together as a result is not something we should just let fly in the wind. It is the most central tenet of any society that wants to be able to come to compromises and agreements about how to act. How can we know how to act if we can't even agree on the circumstances surrounding that action? It's impossible. So if we can focus on the circumstances rather than the action, the world will get a little bit more rational and become a better place to live in.